It's time to go on the record with WRAL News.
Good evening. I'm Travis Fain. On an average day, the average person processes a massive amount of information from their cell phone, television, and other devices. One study put it at 15 and a half hours a day, the equivalent of watching 6 movies per person just in digital information. And that study was from 10 years ago, and it doesn't include work. This is more information per day than a human being living a few hundred years ago would be exposed to in their lifetime. Tonight, we'll talk about what that means for us, and particularly what it means for children growing up in a digital age. We've got a therapist, the head of digital learning for Wake County Schools, and you'll hear from teenagers about this information onslaught tonight. But we begin with Mitch Prinstein, a psychology and neuroscience researcher at UNC and the chief science officer for the American Psychological Association. He and a team at UNC published earlier this year a 3-year study into how social media in particular impacts young brains. Professor, you scanned people's brains. You found that children who grow up checking social media more often become hypersensitive to feedback from their peers. What does that mean for kids in real life?
Well, we have to remember this is a time when adolescents' brains are developing in incredibly important and sophisticated ways. It's the second most important period of brain development following the first year of life. And what we're seeing is that the more that kids were spending time on their screens, particularly picking up their phones very often, the more their brains were developing to be very attuned to things that were about them, things that made them concerned about how others thought about them, very focused on the kind of feedback that their brains are just starting to develop to make them very interested in and attuned to.
And I'm guessing that's not always healthy. I want to broaden it out a little bit here. You've testified before Congress on some of these issues. Several things stood out as I read your testimony. You said portable technology is changing what took 60,000 years to evolve. That studies show 6th graders with phones pick them up more than 100 times a day. You said peer interactions, what you were talking about just a minute ago, are so important to a child's development that they have a stronger effect on their emotional and mental health and on the type of job they get, even their physical health, compared to their IQ, how much money their family has, and their education level. What does it mean when so many of those peer interactions move online? How does that affect us?
Well, these are very different than what we see from in real life or offline peer interactions. You know, the kind of communication, it's asynchronous. So they're talking with people who are not responding to them in real time. It's usually lacking voice to voice or face to face contact. The things that they're talking about are permanent. They're, able to be accessed and copied and shared. But maybe most important, they're being guided by computers. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are now picking our friends for us, letting us know which of their interactions we should see first, and even encouraging us to like things or agree with things just because we saw other people doing the same. That's something very, very new for our species.
Yeah, and I imagine evolution takes time. It takes a much longer period of time. I mean, how are we ever going to change our brains to where this is normal?
Well, we're doing it now. I mean, most of us are experiencing, and kids in particular, reporting a remarkable high level of stress as a result of this. They are overloaded with the number of notifications they're getting across platforms. They're being bombarded with so much information, and they're experiencing a remarkable amount of anxiety about what they might miss out if they put their phone down, or how people might respond to something that they post. We just have no analogous way of thinking about this from back in the 70s and the 80s, when there was no way to interact 24/7. There was no concern that what you said or did might be permanently captured and spread across the World Wide Web.
Yeah, and it's not just social media. I want to talk more broadly about email, text messages, videos, all these things in our pocket. I spend more hours than I care to contemplate just staring at this thing. I'm looking for something new. It doesn't have to bring me joy. It doesn't have to educate me. It can be a work email at 9 p.m. It just has to be new. Professor, why is that? Why am I like that?
I mean, we are all social animals. This is why we're here, is because our species became a social species that worked together. So even though we weren't the strongest of the species 60,000 years ago, we were the only ones that developed language and became able to work together. So we are exquisitely sensitive to social interactions. And now we have the opportunity to engage in them all the time around the world with a press of a button to quantify how well those social interactions are going with likes and followers. And whether we like it or not, we've now really gotten sucked into a device that's kind of, bar pressing for dopamine, all the time and giving us a remarkable reaction that, we're not used to. It's very new for us to try to adapt to this kind of a context now.
You mentioned dopamine. Talk a little bit more about that and the chemicals in our brain that impact us and how we live our lives, and how social media and tech companies have kind of tapped into this. I mean, I've seen some studies that indicate that parts of the brain firing when you're looking at social media are not that dissimilar from slot machine playing.
That's right. And there's also overlap with the areas of the brain that we see involved in addiction to illegal substances. Now, in the year before you start noticing physical changes associated with puberty, the brain has already kick-started some development. One of the first areas that develops is an area that has a lot of receptors for dopamine and oxytocin. So oxytocin, you probably know, is a chemical in the brain that allows us to, crave social bonding, particularly among our peers. Dopamine makes that feel really good. So why does this happen? Some think that maybe it's to help teens become more autonomous and really strive to leave their parents and develop peer relationships. It was never designed, though, to allow us to quantify and incessantly kind of seek that kind of feedback that we can now get on social media. So we might have this overreaction going on of those receptors. And ironically, this is happening when we're giving kids these devices. It's coinciding with the exact worst possible time to do so, because it's when their brains have just started to become hypersensitive to those dopamine and oxytocin responses.
All right, I'm going to ask all our guests this, but I'll ask you this now. At what age should a child get a cell phone?
There's no one age that we know is the time when the risks are gone. It's really a decision that parents have to make for their own kids. There are reasons why parents want their kids to have access to some way of communicating with them when they start becoming independent. They do still sell dumb phones. So it doesn't have to be a smartphone that allows the capability to interact on social media. But it's also really important to remember that a lot of parents fear that if they don't give their kids a smartphone, they'll be the only child that's not interacting on the internet. So there's been some success of having communities band together and decide as a group that they're going to wait until at least 8th or ninth grade before they let their kids have unfettered access to smartphones.
Yeah, just personally, my daughter is in 5th grade already. A lot of her friends have cell phones, and already she is pushing for one, wants one quite badly. We're going to pause here. And when we come back, we'll add a couple more experts to our panel. You'll hear also from teenagers dealing with these things every day. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back. We're talking about the impact cell phones and information overload have on our lives. In addition to our UNC professor who studies these things, we're joined by Mary Jernigan, a therapist and president of the North Carolina Licensed Professional Counselors Association. Also, Allison Reed, the head of digital learning for Wake County Schools. Welcome to both of you. Ms. Jernigan, I want to start with you, but I'm going to play a clip first that I recorded earlier this week with some local high school students. Then I'll ask you a question to respond to it. This is 11th grader Sadiq Jones talking about social media.
I think that's where a lot of anxiety and depression forms from kids, from where I say kids that get social media, especially at an early age, where you can a lot of people put their lives on social media, and I don't think it's a great idea. And I've seen a lot of people change based off of what they put out there and what they're getting back, like the information and the comments that they're receiving. They rather change themselves instead of, feel good enough to accept themselves.
All right, Ms. Jernigan, that hurts my heart a little bit to hear. I've seen a lot of people change because of comments they hear online. How do we avoid that, or at least keep it from being an overriding negative for our young people?
Yes, well, that's a great question. And it really begins with forming one's own inner personality development from the home and outward. And really, there are so many positive benefits to taking those breaks from a media device in the home, to increase co-regulation in the home with parents when the children are being validated by their parents and they can freely interact with their community and with nature with these co-regulation elements. That's really when various elements help to build and strengthen their own inner core, their internal locus of control for that personality development.
All right, so that kind of boils down to do things together. I'm curious not just about cell phone usage in kids, but in adults. What does it do when my daughter sees me sitting on the couch and instead of paying attention to her, I'm staring at my cell phone?
Yes, well, and it's about life balance as well. There's a lot of things that we're navigating as parents, busy lives, but basically with the social modeling theory, you're showing her that, and parents are showing that we can go to our devices first for soothing elements. And if there is an opportunity for balance in the home, really that's kind of the best ideal for every home environment.
All right, Ms. Reed, you oversee digital learning for Wake County Schools. Every student in Wake County has a laptop assigned to them, a Chromebook, so it's kind of a stripped down laptop. During the pandemic, of course, we had virtual schools. So many kids have their own cell phones. How cognizant is the school system of, is this too much? How cognizant are you of looking between teaching technology and avoiding digital overload?
I think that's a great question. I fully agree with what my colleagues here have said while we've been together, but I think it's important to note that there is a very, very marked difference between how we use technology for different things. And so there's a difference between being a creator, using technology as a tool, and being a passive consumer of technology. Sitting on a Chromebook or using a Chromebook to write an essay or build a movie or to do research in order to write a paper is far, far different than sitting there and watching a movie, right? And so how we use technology in the school is more important than necessarily the number of minutes that they use on that. We are very, very cognizant of that. And so how we structure our curriculum and our lessons and our learning, we do work with our teachers on helping them to understand that balance, how to use technology in ways that are effective to help kids get better and smarter and more savvy. But it's also really important. We have a responsibility to teach them digital literacy as well, right? This is the world that they live in. We're not educating kids for our past. We're educating them for their future. And their future is going to have technology as a part of it, like ours did not at their same age, right? And so there's an obligation for us to make sure that we are giving them the skills to navigate not only technology in general, but also to look at things like social media and help them understand, as my colleague here mentioned, that there's AI in the backgrounds that is manipulating what you see. And how do you learn how to be a digital detective, if you will, and to parse out what you're seeing? And so I think that is something that we most certainly have at the forefront of our work. And it's something that we're really, really cognizant of.
Yeah, to try to consume it really kind of without warping your reality and realizing that people tend to only show the good stuff on social media. Comparison is the thief of joy, as they say,
Yes.
right, Ms. Reed?
It is. In fact, I always, I joked with my own children as they were coming through middle school and high school in particular, so much so that it got to be an eye roll and all their friends would even repeat it back to me. I would say, your worth is not quantified by the number of likes on your social media. And every time they'd pull out the phone, I'd say, your worth, and they could finish the sentence, to the point that they would even parrot it to their kids, or to their friends rather. And so, just being really, really intentional about how we talk about social media use with our children, and with our students, and be realistic. I believe my other colleague talked about co-regulations and doing things together. Are you using social media with your kid, or do you have that unfettered access that was mentioned earlier? It doesn't make sense to give, a 12-year-old unfettered access to the internet, but that's a very different scenario when a parent is sitting beside them, doing it with them, learning with them, having conversations about what they see. That is no longer passive consumption. It is creative exploration that's building relationships. And so focusing on those sorts of things helps kids to have a more healthy relationship with it. I don't foresee a future where social media is going away, but it most certainly is a problem, and is one that we really need to work with our parents and with our kids to learn how to evaluate their use and what they're seeing and how they interact with it, for sure.
Yeah, and I should note, it's not all bad. I mean, some of the people that I reached out to for this story, I reached out to through social media. I've seen some studies that say it's not necessarily negative. There's a story from Stanford that said they couldn't find a correlation between the age a child got a cell phone and well-being, but there is a lot more research that says there is a problem. There's a famous documentary now on Netflix, Ms. Jernigan, called The Social Dilemma, and it basically postulates that social media is a drug. Is social media like a drug?
It can be especially if it is utilized outside of balance. We, in my work with children and family, I encourage families to really identify balance in the home and monitor, maybe even put time parameters on the screen usage as well. But to also really diversify what the activities are in the home, that creating a schedule and a routine for the families as well seems to really help to just infuse that balance into the home environment.
And while I've got you, let me ask you, what age should a child get a cell phone?
It really, in my practice, I've worked with, children and adolescents and families for around 15 years now. And it really just varies depending from family to family, from child to child, and really depending on the diagnosis. If a child has a diagnosis such as, sensory integration challenges, you may want to moderate it a little bit more further than a child that really can benefit from having various apps that promote, educational access and tutoring. I really think that also utilizing social media for the positive to promote academic excellence is a great way that parents can encourage, that really healthy use of media in the home. And I encourage parents to consider, saving that screen time for academics. One of the positive benefits that, has shifted from post-pandemic household life is that we have access to telehealth in the homes now for therapy. That's been such a benefit to mental health in our state. So there are so many positives to social media, as you mentioned earlier. It's just about finding the balance.
And Ms. Reed, same question for you. At what age is it okay for a kid to get a smartphone?
I think it depends on factors that they mentioned. I think it depends on context. If your children are in the home with you and are rarely away from you, that is a very different set of circumstances than a child who is riding public transportation or school transportation and is going to be independent, for hours without contact otherwise. I think it depends a lot on how much time a parent is willing, or how much time a parent has available to sit with the student and to work with their own child on learning how to use it well. So, I think it's dangerous sometimes for us to try to quantify that across the board for everyone, because as they mentioned, children are so different and their needs are so different, right? And so I really think the key to all of it is knowing your child and recognizing what is best for them based on what you know. You might not understand the technology per se, but you can understand your child, or at least you're going to know better than anybody else. So it's hard to answer that for other parents.
All right, we're going to take one last break. When we come back, we'll lay out some more advice for parents. We'll talk about misinformation online, which is a big problem for some of us adults. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking about living and parenting in our digital age, coping with the massive amounts of information that bombards us every day. Social media is a big part of this. I want to play a clip from Richard Bissett, a high school senior I spoke with this week. This is his advice for parents whose kids might be just getting a cell phone or joining social media.
Go and test the waters a little bit. I know it seems like a big jump to being on social media, but oftentimes what helps kids, like for example, what helped me a lot, and having my parents right there with me. But over time, you start to grow into it. You start to realize, okay, I don't really need to use my phone all the time. I don't need to be on Instagram or Snapchat all the time because you've already been through that phase.
All right, Ms. Jernigan, that's along the lines of the advice you give parents, right, to kind of ease their kids into social media together, lay out rules that aren't all that different from rules for real life.
Yes, if there's a parallel that can be drawn to an extent between the parents and the children, that could be very helpful. You're just continuing to model that effective balance within yourself. But additionally, any a kind of opportunity to connect with your child in your child's world, whether that is a very young child and you're engaged in their play with their toys on the floor or on up until adolescent when they're kind of integrating that technology more, really trying to understand. And when parents are able to share that experience with their child with social media, and it just really helps to be a learning experience for the parents as they're really just trying to enter their child's world.
Ms. Reed, I want to ask you about misinformation. At the schools, are we teaching children how to sift through news coverage? Are we teaching people how to sniff out the lies that they can find online? And 15, 20 years from now, when these kids are adults and they're running the world, are they going to be a little bit better at sniffing out misinformation online than people in our generation?
Oh man, I hope so. I think they are, though. We absolutely are focused on that. All of our media coordinators in our district, I'm fortunate to get to work with our amazing librarians in Wake County, and all of our media coordinators do have training and professional learning on helping kids with digital literacy, how to parse out fact from fiction, how do the algorithms work and what they suggest to us, how do you look at something that you read online, and what is sort of the sniff test to figure out how accurate something is, and how do you go back and check their sources? And that is absolutely part of what we are sharing with our teachers and resources that we're sharing with our teachers to pass along and integrate into their lessons, as opposed to just separate standalone lessons, right? We want to make sure that we're infusing that into our instruction. And I do think that our kids are much more adept than we were at that age of being able to ferret out what might have bias in it. When I was in high school, there were 3 major networks and they were all on at just one time for just 1 hour. So the amount of information we got at that age is so much more limited. And I'm not sure that I'm convinced it was unbiased, but it all said the same thing. So it felt like that. And our kids, if nothing else, are exposed to far more different opinions and perspectives via their news sources. It not only are there more than 3 channels now, there's more than 5 to 10 different modalities from which they can get their news, right? They can read on Twitter, they can go to websites, they can be on Instagram, Facebook, the news, podcast. The opportunities for them to get information and misinformation are almost endless right now. So it's critical that they learn to be good sleuths about what they ingest and what they take on as fact. And so that's definitely part of what our focus is.
All right, that's something that we could all stand to learn a little bit more about, I think. I think we're going to leave it there. I want to thank our panelists for taking the time tonight. Thank you to you at home for focusing on this. Sometimes it's not so easy. I hope not too many of you are looking at your cell phone while you're watching this. As with anything else, you have to decide how much makes sense for your family in the face of peer pressure. You heard that time and again from our experts tonight. So I encourage those conversations to happen at the family level. Thank you for your attention. If you have something to say about tonight's discussion, you can follow us on Twitter, twitter.com/WRAL. Email us your questions, your comments, your criticisms on the record at WRAL.com. You can also write us a letter. That's P.O. Box 12,000, Raleigh 27605. Thank you for joining us and have a pleasant evening.